I would like to welcome everyone who's participating and attending this webinar, whether through Zoom or on our IFI's Facebook page. This is the first webinar organized by the Issam Fares Institute, and it will not be the last one, as we are starting a series of webinars on different topics relating to public policy in Lebanon and the region. I'm glad that we're starting the series with a special partner, an exceptional platform for Arab women empowerment. She is Arab. On this note, I welcome Samar Shorafa, co-founder of She is Arab, to say a few words before we start the webinar. Samar?
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And I would like to start by thanking the Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy at AUB and the team who made this possible. Of course, Suzanne, Hannah, and everybody. She's Arab is a speakers platform working to address the issue of underrepresentation of Arab women, both on speaking platforms and in business. And we're delighted to be here today. We've actually taken all our events digitally because of COVID-19 in an effort to showcase our speakers. Our moderator today is one of them, Reema Selim. She's the founder and manager of Global Humanitude, a consulting organization based in Brussels, Belgium, where she joins us from today. Reem brings close to 2 decades of on-the-ground experience in forced displacement and humanitarian work, working for most of her professional life with the UNHCR, serving with it on all continents in conflict and post-conflict areas. She has extensive experience in the important functional areas of humanitarian response, refugee protection, and policy advocacy and strategies, as well as civil society engagement and strengthening. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Reem to get us started.
Thank you very much, Samar, and thank you to the Issam Fares Institute for inviting me to be part of this webinar, and also a very warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, facilitators, and as well everybody who's joining us online. Before I introduce my speakers, I wanted to walk you through some housekeeping issues. So what we will do after the introduction is that we're going to go through an initial round of short questions and answers with each speaker. So we have 3 of them. And after each one of them is done, we will open the floor shortly to our listeners online for 1 or 2 questions that you may have, and that would be addressed to the speaker herself based on what she has just said. That will take us more or less up to 4 o'clock, and then the last half an hour, and we hope that you will all be sticking around for that, would be for a more intensive Q&A with our listeners online. Now, since there is a large number of people that have signed up for this webinar, which is very exciting, I want to just clarify that we will only take questions in writing. So please send them through the Q&A function, and I will be addressing them depending on where we are in the conversation. And yes, as normal, of course, please keep your microphones muted since we are a large group. I think I have covered most of the housekeeping issues. And without further ado, I would like to actually take a few moments to introduce our speakers. And we have really a group or a lineup of amazing women with us. My first guest is Maysa Jalbout, who is a recognized leader with 25 years of experience in international development and philanthropy. She's currently a visiting scholar and special advisor on the UN Sustainable Development Goals at MIT and ASU, and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute. She was the founding CEO of the Abdullah Al Ghurair Foundation for Education, a landmark philanthropic initiative based in Dubai with a budget of 1 billion. She was also the founding CEO of the Queen Rania Foundation in Jordan. And Forbes recognized Maysa as one of the 100 most powerful businesswomen in the Arab world in 2016 to 2018. And my second speaker is Zara Buzzy. who is a program manager at the Arab NGO Network for Development since November 2011. And her work mainly entails research coordination and project management focused on development, governance, and human rights policies. And she is engaged in networking and cooperation with national, global civil society organizations. She has also worked previously as program associate at UNDP Program on Governance in the Arab region, and also on anti-corruption and integrity in the Arab countries from 2007 till 2011. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Mirna Atalla, who is the executive director of Al-Fanar, the Arab region's first venture philanthropy organization, which provides tailored funding, high engagement management support, and real-time impact evaluation to ambitious enterprises working to improve children's education. And under Mirna's leadership, Al-Fanar has expanded actually its portfolio of social investments within Egypt, to Lebanon, to refugee communities, and most recently to Jordan. Now, before that, she had worked at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Beirut, and she there managed civil society strengthening work and supporting the training of women and youth candidates. So welcome to all of you. Perhaps before we get started with you, Maisa, I wanted just to a little bit frame this conversation and why we are here. So, of course, you know, COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on the work of civil society globally. And already analysts and researchers that have been following this have pointed essentially to two different kinds of impact. And I'm speaking more globally here. So on one hand, the usual way of doing business of civil society has been disrupted, so at least to some extent. And you know, this is due to a number of reasons, so extended lockdown measures, hampering their ability to organize and meet and advocate. And of course, also in a number of countries, governments are using the COVID crisis to tighten their grip and you know, on the work of NGOs through measures like state surveillance, censorship, and also the weakening of checks and balances. On the other hand, however, there's an emerging evidence that the COVID pandemic may have rejuvenated, if you will, civic action, forcing civil society actors to be more creative. So not only on how they are working, but also who they are partnering with, how they are partnering. So in some countries, we've seen them, for example, engaging more with business, you know, business actors than before. And they have, of course, also filled important gaps, not just in the mitigation and the response, making sure that the most vulnerable are not left behind, are included, but also in holding governments and other powerful actors accountable. And some of them see COVID and post-COVID world as a, let's say, as bringing opportunities to inform more and advance more ambitious reform agendas. And in all of that, of course, the philanthropy organizations and foundations and individuals have played a crucial role, and we've seen them put money for mitigation and response, as well as for research to find vaccines, etc. And when I talk about philanthropy, of course, I also mean zakat, which, you know, plays a huge role in responding to social and humanitarian needs in our region. So, having said that, then, you know, it's therefore understandable that the MENA region is not an exception to this, and that COVID also has made itself felt in that region as well. So perhaps turning to you, Maisa, I was just curious, why do you think it was important to draw attention to the impact on civil society in the MENA region? Because this is what you have been doing also personally.
Great, thank you, Reem, for that fantastic introduction. Before I answer the question, I just wanted to say a great big thank you to IFI for kicking off their webinar series with us. We're really honored. They are such an important voice in the region, bringing forward important voices. I also want to say a special thanks to She is Arab, which is such an important new social enterprise and initiative. And I encourage all the women listening to sign up to the platform and engage in the discussions that are taking place. And lastly, to everyone who's signed up and participating, we know you have a lot of choice. There are a lot of webinars, so thank you for tuning in. We hope we can have a very interactive conversation. Now, it's not surprising that in the discussions that are taking place internationally and regionally, we are primarily hearing about the impact of the pandemic on health and the economy, but less so on the most vulnerable people around the world. And this is definitely the case here in the region. Unfortunately, we are seeing that the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable people in the region, refugees, marginalized communities of all sorts, women, rural communities, those who are in the lowest economic bracket. And naturally, those people, in the absence of government assistance, will seek help from civil society. So nonprofit entities, social enterprises that are their main lifeline, whether it is for employment or for social services, counseling, and sometimes education as well. The last few months have shown, particularly in countries where they've experienced a lot of trauma, whether it's due to ongoing wars and conflicts or economic instability, such as in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, plenty of places across the region. Those are also the hardest hit in terms of the impact of COVID on those communities. As they turn to civil society is obviously doing all it can to respond, but the demand is so high that the impact on those organizations is crushing. They are, as a result, many of them facing an existential crisis. They are facing a downturn in the amount of financial assistance that they receive, because naturally they would rely on fundraising events to raise funds, which have now come to a standstill. They may be selling products and services that they are less able to do that in this context. And of course, donations have also decreased, particularly individual donations. So it's a double whammy. They have an increase in demand and a decrease in the amount of resources. Now, it's really important to mention that the pressure on civil society has been there for a long time. And this is in large part because they don't have consistent, sustainable funding. They are not well endowed. They are constantly operating on a shoestring budget. And so it's a long-term issue exacerbated by continuous challenges in the region. And now COVID has really just put a tremendous amount of pressure that they cannot withstand without some serious changes. And I think this is where we want to spend the majority of our discussion. I also just want to point out to something that's equally as important, because it's not just about resources, it's also about their ability to deliver their support to vulnerable people. COVID has really disrupted our way of life in general. For many of us who perhaps are participating in the discussion today, we're able to work at home. But for these nonprofit entities and social enterprises, they're on the ground. They need to be able to support people face to face, because we're talking about very vulnerable communities, whether they're people with disabilities or abused women or refugees in camps where they don't have a lot of infrastructure. And all of that has been disrupted. What that means is that on top of all of the pressure, they also have to adapt super, super quickly to a new way of operating. Many of them have risen to the challenge, and I hope we hear some examples of that. But many, many more are struggling and need to be supported very, very quickly in order for them to make this very important transition.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you for raising the issue of refugees and migrants. And of course, you know, our region is host to a lot of conflict and the humanitarian consequences of that. And it's been very clear that in those countries where refugees and migrants were included in the response from the very beginning, it has, you know, been crucial for stemming and stopping the spread of the virus. I'm thinking in particular of Jordan, for example. Okay, and then therefore, I mean, you've talked about all these challenges and also the funding, and as you rightly mentioned, there were already a lot of challenges in getting adequate funding. So therefore, what has to change in the region in order to better support, you know, civil society and overcome these changes? I know that you recently published an op-ed, which is entitled "Why MENA Needs to Change the Way its way to support civil society," and there you called for change. So what type of change is needed, and how do you see it happening actually?
Wonderful, thank you for the question. Yes, I wrote an article for IFI as I am a fellow with them. And again, in an effort to try to bring the very important perspectives of civil society forward. And I should say that was informed by the extremely important work of 26 organizations from across the region that are quite diverse. So, you know, if you're listening, I want to thank you again for participating and sharing your important perspective. In terms of changes, I think that despite the crisis that we're in, this is a moment that we cannot, you know, this is an opportunity that we cannot lose. The changes that we need to see within the sector and in the way that the sector needs to be supported have long been overdue. One of the biggest changes, let me start with sort of the philanthropic sector as well as the donor community and their role in supporting the nonprofit and social enterprises in the region. And then move into what I think the sector itself should do. And it's important to say we're all extreme supporters of civil society here. So what I think we want to do is have a very frank discussion about the fact that, you know, as a sector, we need to change as well and adapt and grow. So the first thing is we need the donor community to act in a very different way than it has been. Because unfortunately, the crisis that we're in today is in large part perpetuated by the drip donor approach that we're seeing in the region. We need donors to come together. This is a trend that we are starting to see grow very successfully around the world, but unfortunately not in the Arab world. Pooling funds between philanthropists, between donor communities, including aid agencies, is essential if we are going to see funding being leveraged and used in a strategic way to be able to respond to the massive impact. If we're going to put pressure on civil society to scale up to meet the demand, we also need to be able to scale up the resources that are available. And it makes a whole lot of sense to be able to pool funding and to share not just cash assistance, but resources, because we recognize that those sectors have a lot to bring to the table. That's point number one. Point number two is the private sector has a lot of resources that the nonprofit sector would love to have access to. I mentioned earlier that we're seeing civil society struggle to digitize, you know, and come into sort of the e-economy and e-operations. The private sector, including some governments in the region, have actually done a fabulous job of doing that. And that transfer of know-how, the skills and the resources that comes with that would be a tremendous asset to the nonprofit sector and a great way for them to contribute when they are also cash strapped at this time. And third, and cannot be underestimated or cannot state it enough, we need to invest in long-term capacity development of this sector. We are not going to be able to wave some magic wand where they're suddenly going to be able to deliver everything online and everyone's going to be able to scale up. No amount of cash can make that happen. This is a methodological, strategic process that requires long-term partnership and investment, which is why I'm so happy to have my two co-panelists, because, you know, they have a lot of expertise in this space. So I'll end there. Basically, pooled funds, in-kind contribution, in digitizing and skills and resources, and long-term capacity development and partnership.
Yeah. Indeed, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of changing the way organizations advocate with governments, with donors, and already there is some work happening on that front. Maisa, there was a question that came in with regards to clarifying a bit your statement that there isn't enough funds, because the person who's asking the question says that they thought that there was a lot of money available for Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So, yeah.
Well, I was I think it's true that there are times where there's either a perception of a lot of funding, or the funding is directed in areas where it's not necessarily going to lead to an increase in capacity development of civil society organizations. So let me clarify on that. When the crisis in Syria started and refugees started to pour into Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, there was a lot of sudden onset of funding coming from the international community. Unfortunately, I've written about this extensively. Most of that funding went to international organizations, with very little actually trickling down to civil society organizations within country, those that remain today. So it's really important, of course, to mention that for donors, that if you're going to see a change in the long-term support for vulnerable communities, you need to invest in the organizations that are front and center, on the front lines of serving the most vulnerable people. We're starting to see a change in that. We know that organizations are starting to collaborate a lot more. And thanks to organizations like Al-Fanad and other, there's a lot more investment in local organizations, but simply not enough. But it is a misnomer to say that there is a lot of funding for the refugee crisis. In fact, most donors have not yet made right on their commitment, on their pledges. So please delineate the difference between pledges and actual cash that makes it on the ground. Lebanon and Jordan in particular are still missing a lot of those funds.
Yeah, and maybe just to add that the crisis also brings to the forefront the need for donors to be more flexible in the funding that they provide and allow for more unearmarked funding, so that organizations have a little bit of leeway also to use it swiftly and adapt quickly to the emerging needs and priorities. And there sometimes that can be a challenge. Well, thank you, Maisa, for that. I would like to bring in Zahra, who also has extensive work with civil society. So, I mean, Zahra, it's a different way of working now, a lot of pressures and a lot of expectations that civil societies also adjust and become more agile and more active. And for example, in the area of advocacy, I mean, having to advocate with governments, having to advocate with donors, as we had from Maisa, for their own interests and the constituency they represent, and making sure that the most vulnerable are also taken into consideration. So what are the precise challenges that you see in the area of advocacy and just policy issues for civil society organizations, and what can, right now and also post-COVID, how will that evolve in your view?
Thank you, Reem. So yeah, actually I work for a network of NGOs that is mainly focused on advocacy, social and economic policies, fighting inequality, issues in general. And the current crisis actually is exacerbating somehow the existing inequality, and as mentioned by Maysa, and the power dynamics also are changing and getting more complicated when we are in time of crisis. So the situation is worsened in terms of inequalities and is disproportionately affecting women, migrants, homeless, the working class in general, and so many more. And the response in our perspective cannot be solved with public health and emergency measures only, but should go beyond this, should have a wider, inclusive, and human rights-based approach to the response itself. And here it opens up a more role and more opportunities for civil society, if we want to say it like this. But also times of crisis like this is times where we saw, if we go back to past experiences, that harmful agendas are put on the table and are pushed and advanced by governments and by people in power in general. So this is also a moment that is more challenging in terms of violation of human rights, violations of freedoms, increased corruption as well. In times of crisis, corruption increases in general, and also times where agendas of rough economic policies are put in place, austerity measures, alleviation of subsidies, etc., could be put on the table. And this is something that relates a lot to the Lebanese context now, where we're facing socio-economic and the crisis of COVID together, and we see the reforms plans of the governments and the push towards that kind of rough economic agendas and measures to be put in place. A lot also could be said here around the politics and the accountability mechanisms that are put on hold in such situations. So now we're seeing more and more in different countries in the region that the roles and the powers of the executive sector, the executive power, are taking more, are being more extended and more taking more role in responding to the crisis, while we see that possibility of accountability, be horizontal or vertical accountability, are also put on hold. And this is particularly right for the role of the civil society in holding the government accountable. So most of the measures and the possibility of work for civil society to do this are being impossible due to the measures in place, to social distancing, to the confinement, etc., measures that are taking place. So possibility to engage local communities, possibility to mobilize, possibility to do real advocacy are limited by the crisis itself and by the measures taken by the governments. It should be noted also that emergency legislation are put in place in many countries in the region. So it depends on the nomination. Some countries call it emergency legislations. Others are talking about other forms of but at the end, we are putting some emergency measures that could be curbing civic engagement and restricting fundamental rights. And this also apply to other countries than our region only. And demonstrations, protests are hindered. And for example, in Lebanon, we were in the crisis came after the revolution, after the protests, the movements in the streets of the people, and the measures stopped the possibility for people to do their social accountability along with with the other accountability measures taken by other institutions. It's also
I have a question for you, if you don't mind. I mean, these are very real challenges which you mentioned. At the same time, I understand that NGOs have, taken up very creative measures in order to overcome some of these limitations you mentioned. So I was wondering if you can speak maybe to the, examples where people have used communication channels very effectively, to overcome the limitation of social distancing, of actually being in person together due to social distancing. And also if you've seen, therefore, a different reconfiguration of organizations, so maybe organizations that wouldn't work together because of ethnic, religious, political divides. Do you see a rapprochement between them? Do you see them, moving more towards each other and working together than before?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to mention briefly also additional channels without going further, like the issues of access to information that changed also due to the situation, and the difficulty to gain momentum around causes. Whenever you have an emergent situation like the one we're living now, it's difficult to gain momentum around specific advocacy areas, and this is also need to do. Maisa talked about the financial constraints and the need for civil society to do much more in these circumstances while they have less. So this is briefly the challenges that we are all facing in this situation. However, yeah, we need to see the opportunities and what the organizations are trying to do in order to respond or to sustain themselves in this situation. And I think a major point here, and after saying that the situation needs a holistic approach and inclusive approach, and in the response itself, here comes the added value of the organization and the opportunity of the civil society itself to respond due to the strength they have, the expertise, the resources they have developed over the years, and the principles that they've been working on and they were pushing for here are being more and more relevant, and shows the relevancy in such situations. Also, I wanted to say that it's an opportunity for civil society also to respond to the criticism that we've been hearing around civil society, being disconnected from the grassroots, being disconnected from local communities. So this is these moments provide this opportunity to go back to this, to really see what the people need, and to do the link with grassroots organization, to do the link with local communities, to bring up their voices, to bring up the needs that are emerging more into the advocacy dialogue and the policy dialogue. And here, it gives the necessity for civil society to do more coalition building and more networking, and to enlarge their work, to open up to other components than the NGO sector itself, and to work with trade unions, to work with social movements, to work with emerging youth groups, professional associations, and private sector, and bring them all in the table, especially if they want to have an advocacy role, and a role that is now very much needed and clearly needed in informing the response of the government when it comes to COVID-19.
Yeah, indeed. No, thank you for that. And in fact, looking at these other actors, Mirna, I understand that you are very much plugged into the world of philanthropy and also social entrepreneurs. So in order to give this also a positive spin and cast the light on the lot of very good work that is happening, and that also Zahra spoke to, and efforts made. So Can you give us maybe some examples on how social entrepreneurs in the region are, are turning this crisis into an opportunity, not just for the response now, but also in the future?
Absolutely. Thank you, Reem, and all of, Mesa, Zahra, IFI. It's really exciting to be part of this panel, and it is really an important moment to be discussing what we can all do, whether we're on the ground, or whether we are, philanthropists, donors, investors, etc., in the social space. So I think just to give a little bit of context for the examples that I'll give, Al-Fanar is a venture philanthropy organization, which is, a gorgeous mouthful, but it's part of, a broad global movement, which is just worth understanding because it's very much a response to many of the issues that we're seeing play out today. So at the heart of it, Al-Fanar is essentially a platform for philanthropists, mostly individuals, in fact, small, medium, and large, as well as a growing number of corporate foundation partners who sort of share a vision that we can pool, to Mesa's point, our capital together and help it go further towards sustainable change and results, specifically and directly within vulnerable communities. And when we started 15 years ago, we chose quite, intentionally those areas that had the highest social returns on investment. So in particular, children's education and women's economic empowerment. And we've also added, because of the needs of the region, youth unemployment. And so within that framework, we are this platform for engaged and strategic philanthropists, but with a team on the ground that then goes on, not unlike a private equity fund, but for social enterprises that goes on the ground, runs due diligence, and finds ambitious social enterprises in these areas to back and invest in. And these are both nonprofits that we are helping develop some form of self-generated revenue so as to reduce their dependence on donations and grants in the long run, so as to ensure that they're able to be responsive to their communities, have enough reserves so they're not, effaced in times of crisis or when Al-Fanar exits, because that's always our intention, or they might be social purpose businesses, as we're seeing emerge, in the social enterprise space. But globally speaking, I think in terms of civil society and this conversation, it's so important for us to sort of think about how we come together to ensure that civil society organizations, and we in particular, speaking about social enterprises, are really accountable to the communities they serve and not the donors who invest in them. And so that's part of our approach, really. And so how are we doing that? To get to these examples that I'll give, one, funding, absolutely, when we're pooling this capital. We like to think of it as risk capital. So it's grants and zero interest loans, but it is largely flexible. It can go towards salaries. It can go towards marketing. It can go towards digitizing. It enables these organizations, we hope, and because we're doing it with them hand in hand, to properly grow their impact. But funding is necessary. It isn't sufficient always for the growth that we need to see. And so the real glue to the process is high engagement management support. And at a time like this, when organizations are really struggling to know that you can phone somebody at any time of the day, because we are, very, very much attuned to their plans. We understand how to support them and shifting and pivoting. That management support is critical to enabling growth and is an easy way to sort of also plug in-kind mentorship. And the third piece is real-time evaluation and impact evaluation. So we give apps, we develop apps for each enterprise so that they can track very specifically, their growth in social impact, or if there's a change in need, how can they change and be more responsive and also, of course, their finances, because at the end of the day, we need, better decisions and more strategic decisions to sort of derive from data. So what we know that actually the situation is really complicated, because ultimately these are organizations that are running at some level businesses. So any organization that has face-to-face food businesses, textile businesses, these organizations are suffering, where we're fine, and we are responding. We have launched a campaign. We are endeavoring to support these organizations and the communities who have lost jobs to be able to survive, because they need to survive in order to do the important work that's required sort of long-term in terms of employment and education. Where there's some really exciting movements are online. Honestly, any of the investments we have made that either had baked in, if you will, to the impact model or the revenue model, some form of online strategy, are actually able to benefit, and they've been able to pivot very quickly within our new physically distant reality. So I'm excited because I'm proud of all of the organizations. So I'll just give a few. Natakallam.com employs refugees to serve as online language learning partners for Arabic learners worldwide. They also have other languages as well. But actually, while people were sitting at home thinking, what should I do with my time? Maybe I'll learn a new language. They actually experienced a growth in demand. On sort of other fronts, we have an investment in a brilliant organization, Tabshura, in Lebanon, which had already digitized, free, the entire Lebanese curriculum. Suddenly, with the crisis, they were there and present and available to sort of formalize a relationship with the Ministry of Education, and enable larger masses of children stuck at home to access the curriculum. In Egypt, where obviously the scale is massive and children have been out of school since March 13th and are not going back until the fall, not dissimilar to the rest of the world, one of our investees, Educate Me, was just recognized by the Ministry of Education for the speed at which they were able to shift online many of the learning tools that they use in one of the community schools that they run in a slum area for 400 children. And the Ministry of Education has actually asked them to develop a manual to serve as a guide for other organizations and community schools. But similarly, this organization trains 5,000 educators in 150 schools in 6 governments. Because it was able to shift online very quickly, it didn't lose the contracts that it has with, people who have paid for these types of training. So maybe it's self-evident, but I think anybody who is able to sort of shift online has been able to take advantage of the situation to turn the crisis into whatever opportunity they can to continue educating children, to continue providing employment, especially if that employment can also be safe because it is online and physically distant.
And since Maisa and Zahra also addressed the issue of reducing funds, I'm just wondering, do you share that view that there's reducing funds? I mean, maybe other funds can be identified from other non-traditional pots. And I'm just wondering, in the philanthropy section, have you seen more interest by philanthropy, organizations to get involved? Have you seen a shift because of the crisis?
Yes, this is an extremely important question because we are a fundraising organization. So, I mean, we are also fundraising in order to back these, phenomenal social enterprises. So we are seeing sort of shifts and trends and having to adapt. So in terms of changes and movements, I think you identified it in the beginning that there is this awakening, there is this desire to give. And for sure, in terms of crisis, there is an imperative, a moral imperative, and a choice we can all make to get involved at any level to respond to needs. So we are seeing an appreciation and I wouldn't say growth, but I would say continued support, but really an emotive response to emergency. Because, you know, when people are going hungry, you know, it's very difficult to build their capacity later on if they aren't able to eat. So that is absolutely understood, and it's, you know, brilliant. Even we, so for example, you know, we, you know, something I would encourage all donors, including ourselves, so to be agile and nimble, for sure, in order to be responsive. We typically focus on education, economic empowerment, you know, type social enterprises, but we are also very much understanding of what is happening in Lebanon. And so, you know, in March, we had already run due diligence on the Lebanese food bank. Now, the Lebanese food bank has experienced an enormous growth in demand, from 500 food boxes a month to 50,000 food boxes a month in a matter of weeks. Most of the funding is going directly to the food boxes. And so when we approved or, you know, decided to provide a grant, the idea was, what do you need in order to scale your operation, in order to respond? So we were agile in terms of, okay, the sector is absolutely necessary. We need to feed more people. But what does this organization, which is also an umbrella to 100 other, you know, NGOs on the ground delivering, they need warehousing, they need capacity building for their team, they need to think strategy. They too need to be sustainable. Food banks around the world use sustainability strategies. How can we be supportive? So, you know, agile and responsive in terms of the emergencies, but and this might be, you know, almost like I'm contradicting myself, but the part that is going to be required in the long run in order to really scale response is strategic giving, in terms of being open to capacity building needs, being open to sustain a salary. You know, it gave me real pleasure to hear from one of the preschools that we invest in a refugee camp. Because the salaries continue, because our grant enables that to happen, even though the children are at school. It was the only preschool within the Burj al-Barajni camp that was able to shift its instruction immediately online. And so that kind of strategic, if you've made a commitment in a space, try to stick it out, because there are enormous needs coming up in education and employment, etc. So not to just shift wholesale to emergency and forget that there's an entire sector that needs support.
And in fact, on that, there was a question that came in on, you know, this important role that is done by advocacy, and maybe actually I'll see if you know, Zahra, you want to address that. The person who posed the question asked, how do you measure the impact of advocacy as an organization when, you know, when you do it? So over to you. Thank you, Max.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the most difficult questions, and that we face all the time in all our talks with donors, with partners, how to measure the results of advocacy. Actually, we try to not to put indicators that are really complicated when we want to measure advocacy. We need to understand what kind of indicators we can put. So we cannot say that we are changing the whole social and economic policies of a country and then say that we did not achieve. We need to see what is achievable and try to put our indicators in that sense. This is somehow, so what in advocacy, what you can achieve when the situation is complicated, when there is no political will for change, is somehow more mobilization of people, more mobilization of organization around the areas, the human rights, the issues that you are trying to defend. So more knowledge on this. So you need to build on the long term. So your strategy could be a long-term strategy where you're building towards achieving a change on the longer term, and that what you are achieving on the shorter term is more mobilization, more knowledge, more awareness, more engagement of different parties around these issues in order to achieve this change on the longer term.
Yeah. Okay, I'm still looking at the questions that we have are coming in. So, and this is to all of you, but perhaps I first give the floor to Maisa. So, what effort is being made on strengthening cooperation among NGOs or creating a coordination body? So not government. Sometimes it seems there is competition and overlap among different NGOs. That's an issue we kind of also put up front. So Maisa.
It's a really good question, and it's one of those sticky issues that still needs to be addressed across the region. I would say that competition between civil society organizations is common the world over. But what we're starting to see is a number of initiatives that are trying to create a common platform for support. You know, Al-Fanar is a good example here in the Arab world. There are quite a few examples around the world that are essentially trying to create an opportunity to invest in multiple organizations at the same time, to unify the message around needs, to coordinate efforts like we heard just now from MENA about the Lebanese Food Bank, which, you know, really proud of the way that it responded to the need in Lebanon, because in fact, you know, it not only scaled up massively its offerings, but it was supporting Lebanese refugees, all nationalities, in an equal way, which, you know, addresses a major grievance in the way that civil society works across the region. But I think very importantly, what we're starting to see in the way that they collaborate is on the issues that need resolution. So it's not necessarily about coalitions. This is more around tackling those issues that are sticky. So a really good example is the fact that, you know, despite the massive penetration of mobile technology in the region, we still have this really problematic approach to access to banking for the most underprivileged in the region. So you take refugees, or, you know, women who are working in informal economy, or you know, lots of different parts of the communities that civil society works for. These people are unbankable by traditional standards. And so what we're seeing now, for the first time, this massive pressure on the mobile industry to start flowing cash to the communities that they're serving, and to essentially short circuit the banking process. You know, this is a positive coming out of this crisis.
Absolutely, yeah.
No way to reach these people without being able to create electronic wallets. And they're now suddenly working with, you know, the small organizations in the refugee camps that they would normally not deal with, women social enterprises that would be normally have to, you know, go somewhere to be paid cash on a day for daily wage. So I think this is the kind of innovative work that will have sustainable impact as a result of this crisis, as a result of social enterprises and nonprofit entities coming together and saying there is a way to resolve some of these sticky issues.
Yeah, it's not all gloom and doom.
No, it isn't. And it's really important to walk away with this message here today that actually I am incredibly proud to see how civil society has responded to this crisis. You know, whether it is making sure that the message on COVID awareness gets to refugees who have no access to traditional, traditional messaging and traditional support. Whether it's hospitals opening their doors to those who would not be able to have access to care, whether, like I said, food is being distributed in massive numbers, NGOs that are delivering counseling to people with mental illness and depression has skyrocketed, as we all know. And now, organizations are counseling people through whatever methods are available to them, WhatsApp and digital means that were unheard of to be used previously. So there's no shortage of creativity, let's be honest. It has been absolutely amazing how this sector has responded. But what we're talking about today is that they need support and they need to change the way they operate for them to be able to sustain and scale their impact, because unfortunately, let's face it, this crisis isn't going away anytime soon. We're settling in for a long time, and we want to see these organizations there for the long term, because they're needed, and vulnerable people have nowhere to go but to get the support they need from these very, very small organizations on the ground.
Indeed, and I think we often forget that while they also have to respond to the needs of their constituencies and people who depend on them, NGO workers and their families are also at risk. So they are juggling also that challenge at the same time, and at huge costs. So, and in that respect, Myrna, did you have anything you wanted to add to that discussion?
I think it would be interesting maybe to touch on possibly zakat, since it is Ramadan. I'm going to sort of add it into the mix because I think it happens that we're in the middle of a crisis, and it's sort of important to think about this, one of the largest wealth transfers that occurs globally throughout the year, but specifically, right now. And it is highly aligned with the SDGs. And when we have this sort of outpouring of emergency needs, plus all of the critical issues in terms of creating sustainable change on the ground, I think that it is an opportunity for philanthropists who give in this manner to maybe even double down on strategic options in front of them, and to consider pooling their zakat, and really directing it in ways that they can strategically monitor the growth and impact of into the future. So I maybe it was sort of a zinger that we just sort of threw in there, but I think it's important to talk about all the tools that philanthropists have at hand, so that they are, deployed as effectively as possible.
Absolutely, and in fact, one of our listeners suggested that maybe funding isn't so much decreasing as changing, and I think what you're saying is that there is indeed potential for change, not necessarily that it decreases. I know that UNHCR, for example, has made a recent experience with, getting zakat for humanitarian crisis, and my understanding is it's been a very, very fruitful and productive partnership with, entities and persons that are giving zakat. So there was just a couple of things that came in through the chat that I just wanted to address. So someone asked if the Issam Fares Institute had a list of NGOs in Lebanon, and the answer is no. But they work with different networks of NGOs. So not all of them, they have their network. And there was also a question from Ziad on examples of linking relief, rehabilitation, and development. And there, if you allow me, one example that springs to my mind is the whole work that is being done on sort of sustainable livelihood and income generation. So again, if I can use the Jordan example just because I know it better. So there's been, projects funded by donors put in place that allow Syrians to refugees to work in specific sectors, and that brings also improved development for the area in Jordan and also for the host community, and at the same time addresses the issue of becoming more self-reliant and allowing them to exercise the right to livelihood. So it's kind of a win-win on all fronts, and that is being done in a much more, let's say, in a broader manner than before by humanitarian organizations. Okay, I think that was it so far for the chat. I had a question to all of you actually, which is, I mean, on one hand, the NGOs have proven, as you all mentioned, that they've been able to reach the most vulnerable. I'm just wondering if we have seen an increased reliance and realization by governments that this is the case. So have they used actually this access that NGOs and knowledge of community that NGOs have in order to delegate some of the response, involve them more in the response? Or has it been very much of a, has it been a difficult relationship? Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there'll be lots of opinions on this. It'd be interesting also to hear the feedback of people participating. I think one of the challenges that we have in the region around supporting the most vulnerable people is that we don't necessarily always see it as a partnership. The magnitude and the scale of the needs across the region is such that there is no way that any one sector could actually meet the needs of everyone. It needs to be a partnership between all actors. And I'm really glad today that we touched on, the role of nonprofits, the role of UN agencies and whatnot. But I want to talk about a sector that we haven't talked about as much, which MENA knows a lot about, the social enterprises. Mm-hmm. One of the issues that we're not quite giving enough airtime to in the region is the fact that civil society needs to be able to generate revenue in order for it to sustain itself. And there are lots and lots of attempts at doing that in the region, but unfortunately without change in the system and an increase in support and acceptance of this transition, the environment for social enterprises is not yet robust enough and supportive enough. It's a little bit like entrepreneurship in itself, right? Like the small entrepreneur is still struggling to make it in the region. And it's the same with social enterprises. They just don't yet have a good hold on how they can develop that revenue and grow. But Mirna mentioned a few examples of those, and I would really urge that this is a transition that we need to make and make very, very quickly, because it's obvious that unlike, for example, in Australia and in Canada, where when the COVID crisis hit, the government relief packages actually included cash assistance for nonprofit organizations so that they can maintain the salary of civil society staff because they recognize them as essential to the COVID response. This did not happen across the region, and it will not happen anytime soon. So it puts the onus back on organizations to actually be able to generate the kind of revenue that allows them to sustain. And this is where strategic philanthropy comes in, where we need to see them invest in the kinds of things that generate revenue over the long term. And so I think it's a shift in thinking that we need more than anything else. We need to work in partnership. We need to think sustainability. This is not about tossing responsibility or blame. There's no time for that, actually. What we really need to be doing at the moment is thinking about solutions and thinking about those creative enterprises that we mentioned. How do we support them to go forward?
Thank you. Myrna, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I just wanted to, this is really fantastic. I mean, now the conversation feels like it's bubbling, but I did want to go back to 2 points. So one was about government support, you know, and I think Maisa, you know, pointed out very well that, you know, there are no stimulus packages, you know, running and being directed towards nonprofits. That said, you know, generally speaking, when we're running our business plans with organizations, it is typically understood that there's sort of 2 goals that we're all after. One is sustainability, or a large amount of self-sufficiency through self-generated revenue. And I want to get back to that because I do think funding is dwindling. I didn't want to give that impression earlier. So one is that. The second is, can you scale and become enough of a thought leader, like, let's say, Educate Me example I gave in Egypt, that the government is willing to go to a local actor and say, let's partner together. You have this expertise. Let's develop the manual. We don't need to do it, you know, from scratch or go to an international organization to get that information. And in order to be in that position, organizations need to scale massively to be in a position to have this partnership dialogue and discussion, you know, with government. We have brilliant investment in, you know, Upper Egypt that works with female farmers. They work hand in hand with Ministry of Agriculture engineers. There's no way Life Vision on its own is going to be able to transfer enough knowledge to all of the smallholder, you know, farmers in Egypt if it doesn't work hand in hand. Yeah. That said, in Lebanon, because of the crisis, we actually had an increase in applications from some of the largest NGOs who were previously working with government, but government was no longer able to work with them or pay them. And suddenly the question was, well, maybe we need to think about becoming more social enterprise. How can we be more enterprising nonprofits? There's a long history of this, of course, you know, I mean, in Lebanon, but in the region. But I think it goes, it is one of those sort of critical mindset shifts that it is an opportunity for us to embrace, which is at what point in our impact and revenue models can we ensure that there is long-term sustainability in our work and less dependence on fundraising or unreliable, you know, sources of grant funding. Yeah. I do think that it's not, I know that there is a drop in funding towards these entities because the emergency response is so acute and the needs are so vast that it's very hard to naturally invest in an organization that is possibly serving, you know, children with special needs over, you know, feeding people or employing others. So I think that this concept of social enterprise and providing grants for organizations to be able to, you know, make sure that they're solid enough to generate revenue and become sustainable in the long run is going to be critical. And it's an opportunity we all have to bolster civil society. And I think the last thing I would say is about ownership. A lot of times we talk about income generating projects that are not owned by the people who are running them. And, you know, we talk about investees, we talk about and in fact, we don't invest in individuals, we invest in entities that are registered, but it's very important that the knowledge transfer and that the ownership of these vehicles, these social enterprises, is really in the hands of people who can benefit from them, direct them, and grow them and scale them to both lead to greater impact and sustainability.
Yeah, a lot of very important points there, Myrna, and in fact, some reaction from our listeners. So Nadine says that you have mentioned that in times of crisis, a positive aspect is that funding goes as directly as possible to beneficiaries and vulnerable communities, which is absolutely essential. That being said, what are your thoughts on the idea that funding support to CSOs should also include support for the organizational capacity of the CSO, even in times of crisis? Because they are structurally vulnerable, especially in times of crisis. So, yeah, would anyone like to address this, or? Yes, Zahra.
Yeah, actually, I had a few ideas on different points that were raised before and this one as well. So first on the question around working together, networking between organizations, I wanted to say here that there is an important role for donors on this issue, an important and controversial role for donors on this. So we see a lot of that the donors are supporting this kind of cooperation, networking between organizations, are pushing for the creation, establishment of networks everywhere. But at the same time, they are also pushing for agendas, for their agendas and priorities, and which makes more competition between the organization on these issues. So, and this is something that you can see a lot in the situation in Lebanon, in the organizations in Lebanon. That are, for example, taking women's rights organizations, they are competing on the issues, while there is a lot of issues to tackle because of the donor agendas on these. So this question, I mean, needs to be also directed to the donors on how to really support the networking without creating this kind of competition between the organization. Another thing about networking is also related to this programmatic and frame that is put for the organizations. So if we see the response now from different organizations in the region and networks and groups of organizations, they were able to respond in terms of issuing statements, preparing policy papers, doing joint webinars, etc., because they were a bit free from the programmatic frame for their work. So this was an emergency. It wasn't planned. It wasn't in our programs. And this gave us the flexibility to react, to really try to see what is needed and how we can react, especially that we were not, as the organization, overwhelmed with preparation or of events, etc. We were confined, we had the time. So this makes us think about the future, maybe less overwhelming and less putting pressure on organizational things, etc., in order for organization to be more relevant and more able to respond to emergent things, to what are the real needs, to listening more to people is important as a kind of a lesson learned from this situation. On the third point, and very quickly related to the relations with the government, here from an advocacy perspective, I would like to say that maybe governments in the region were relying on organizations to deliver services when needed, some of them, and in the case of Lebanon, it wasn't even the case in terms of services, but in terms of designing the response, putting the policies, designing the policies of response, they were not listening to. And this was, I mean, and this is the result of a survey we done through the network with a lot of organizations in the region that had the same impression that at that time of crisis, government did not consult with the civil society to design the response.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that, Zahra, because as I was thinking about possibilities for scaling up, you know, maybe a government CSO partnership of some sort to address vulnerable needs, you know, I just wonder if that might not turn into like selective scaling up, where, you know, they tell you, yeah, you can scale up in these things, but please don't touch human rights or don't do you know, don't speak about this, don't criticize us on that, and straitjacketing, you know, the CSOs, and that's why I think it will be very important to continue to keep an eye on regulatory frameworks in, you know, in the different countries, and changes to legislation. How are, you know, restrictive changes creeping up into the law that affects NGOs? So not to lose track on that. You know, what is the right of participation and freedom of speech also, and the extent of, you know, the harassment of people that are like human rights defenders, or or put themselves in for specific groups of people. So yeah, it remains to be seen. Now, Mina, coming back to just something you said about social enterprises, Reema wanted to react to that point and said maybe social enterprises have to be part of consortiums to support reduced overhead, and that they can also salvage know-how gathered by each of the social enterprises, and that the consortiums can be between social enterprises and non-social enterprises. Maybe competition ends up to be healthy, as it makes NGOs and social enterprises realize that they need to continue to grow their solutions.
Reema, thank you. Reema is the head of a brilliant organization, Al-Aqra, in Lebanon, and is very much, you know, one of the sort of stalwart nonprofits in education response, but also has a social enterprise aspect that Al-Fanar has invested in. But I think it's a really important question. I mean, I believe in competition. I do believe, I mean, social enterprises, I mean, we're sitting in a civil society conversation, and that's very important because there are many nonprofits, you know, that are social enterprises, but in many ways it is a critique of the traditional nonprofit, you know, structure, and it is an offering of a new capitalistic model that can have double and triple bottom lines, that can say, you know, impact is important, sustainability of the environment is important, and financial sustainability is critical. So I believe that, you know, competition is going to increase. We are going to see a disappearance of some organizations that weren't structurally strong enough to pivot and to take advantage of opportunities. That's usually clearer in social enterprise because there are less masking tools, you know, typically, like, you know, I'm not saying that grants are masking tools, but sometimes, you know, we don't have a clear bottom line in the nonprofit space that, you know, removes some actors. So I do think that it will be harsh, but potentially beneficial to allowing for strongest ideas to emerge. But that said, in this time frame when revenues will drop and there will be a question about, you know, sustainability, the consortium approach will be absolutely critical. And we see this, of course, in the private sector. The private sector merges and acquires a lot, but in the nonprofit sector, because the same, you know, vectors or incentives don't exist. We don't have a social, you know, stock market, if you will. You know, it gets somehow pushed by large donors. Yes, create a network and come together, but it doesn't need to be necessarily. I mean, we do a very simple thing, which is to bring our investees together on a quarterly basis because we believe that they can learn from one another, oftentimes more than we can, you know, top down, you know, teach them. And sometimes actually this allows for the emergence of special projects, larger consortia. You know, Beit al-Baraka and Lebanese Food Bank just, you know, kind of came together to expand. Like there are, I think it would give me great pride and pleasure. And we do this, of course, in the philanthropy space. So we partner with the Houreir Foundation, with Life, with, you know, other people to be able to pool and bring together bigger, greater sort of solutions. It's no different. The issue is it's costly. And if nobody is covering that cost, it can be difficult. So we often say civil society doesn't cooperate, but I think if we can, and this is the benefit of the consortium, is if there is funding that can be, larger pools of funding that can be accessible when we come together and pool, oh, I have expertise in this and you have expertise in this, and we create almost like a value chain for the delivery of a particular service. I think we could transform how civil society is perceived, and how effective we are at making great change.
Can I come in here,
Yes,
Reem,
please.
to add to that? I couldn't agree more. I think if there's one thing that, good thing that we need to come out of this crisis, is that collaboration, partnership is no longer optional. It is about survival. You know, I talk to a lot of donors globally, philanthropists, pooled fund investors, donor agencies, and one of the biggest critiques that they have of the region is that there are no entities that are ready to go to the scale that they would want to invest in. So if you take an organization like Co-Impact, I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with it. You know, they're not investing in the region so far because they can't find a similar entity to what they're finding in places like India and Bangladesh and even parts of Africa, where they're working with a very large number of beneficiaries and can really scale across country or even across region. So even, you know, that's another thing, is that you have organizations that work at really micro level. We're not even talking about national or even regional level. That's one of the areas that needs to change. If we want to see big investment, we're going to need to see big effort on collaboration. And that will actually force the donors to start pooling funds, because the need will be so big that one donor won't be able to meet that demand, but you'll be able to see people coming together because they're interested in investing in similar issues, you know, across the region. And we know that, you know, the big issues, whether it's environment, whether it's education, whether it's refugees, they're not one country issues. They're regional issues that have an impact at scale and need those large dollars. So therefore they need large interventions. So in that regard, I think the crisis that we're facing now has really made us face this issue. And I think it's so opportune and necessary for leaders in the civil society sector, like Reema, yay Reema for bringing up the point, to really be vocal about this and to really step up and have others join in that kind of effort.
But let me ask you then this, do you think that the regulatory framework, again, in the region and in the different countries, allow for, you know, this scaling up? Because I know of several organizations that, you know, would like to do that, but it's just too complicated to actually make it happen, because there's too many obstacles. So even where they exist in different countries, to actually do, let's say, collective work together, even of the same organization, can sometimes prove difficult.
Yeah, no, you raise a very good point, and I've actually written about that. And governments ask for advice on that all the time. We understand that they're missing out on an opportunity to be able to have collaboration, you know, to decrease the amount of funding that's wasted essentially in recreating entities and efforts across the region. They understand that people want convenience as well. So if you want donors to increase the amount of investment that they're making, you need to make it easy for them. They need to be able to donate online, and you know, it's so difficult to be able to do that in the region. And also this idea that, you know, if I want to create a pooled fund, and there are organizations and families in the region that are doing that. We have families, philanthropic families in the region who are working with international organizations on pooled funds. You know, they're partnering with a Gates Foundation on health. You know, they're working with really big universities like MIT on tackling big issues such as you know, poverty research. So we're missing out as a region because we're not creating that opportunity. We're not creating a nimble regulatory framework that allows for that kind of scale. But I believe it's going to start to change. The opportunity is too big.
Yeah.
You know, you're starting to see some leadership within that creates an appetite for this.
Let's hope so. All right.
Optimistic to be in this work.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to say that. So, coming back in the last 5 minutes to you know, the feedback from our listeners. So there is a question from Daniel to actually the three of you. So from where you stand now, if someone were to grant you 2 to 3 of your asks in terms of strengthening civil society in Lebanon, what would you ask for? Maisa, since I have you in front of me, you go ahead first.
Okay, great. Lebanon's getting a lot of attention here, but I just want to say that the three of us work across the region, and interestingly enough, you know, the issues are there are a lot of common issues right across the region. So we may be referencing Lebanon specifically because of the crisis that's been, you know, ongoing there, but the recommendations apply. And my 2-3 wishes, the first one would be to invest in pooled funds, you know, to really create that mechanism. That's number one. Number two would be to invest in really modernizing the sector. You know, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I talk to some amazing minds and people who have moved mountains on a local level, who are frustrated that it takes them so long to be able to scale up their impact, or, you know, frustrated because they don't get the money. You know, some fancy organization comes in because they have really good marketing and lands the big contract while they're sitting there sort of waiting for anything to trickle down. We need organizations to digitize, to become professionalized, to, you know, pay staff their worth so that they can attract the skills that the sector needs. It's not unlike any other sector. It needs people who understand marketing, social media, you know, have capacity in multiple areas that are highly demanded elsewhere. So we need to be able to pay them living wages. You know, not everyone can work as a volunteer in civil society. You know, and nowhere is that more evident when we're working with children, right? We pay so little to young people that serve our most valued, you know, part of our society, working with early childhood educators as an example. I can go on. And the third is to invest in the long-term capacity and development of the organization. Stop investing in delivery only, and think about the fact that every time you do that, you're stripping away the capacity of that organization to be sustainable, to build forward. Those are my 3 wishes.
Great 3 points. Thank you for that. Zahra, I give you the floor.
Yes, thank you, Reem. To be very quick, I think what is needed now for civil society organization is to reassess their existing analysis, strategies, theory of change, in light of what's happening now. So, how can we rethink our strategies in light of what's happening in terms of what is possible now, what is possible politically now, what are the opportunities, studying what is possible, what is not possible anymore, and updating ourselves in that sense. A second point would be, I agree, would be modernizing, using new tools, innovating in our approaches and our way of working. And a third point is more a demand or a ask for governments and for policymakers is to be more open for civil society, to open more space for civic engagement, to open more space for listening, and to, in the same spirit of what Maisa was saying of partnership. It needs to be from different partners in the region, in the country, wherever we are working. And I mean, the crisis that we are facing now, taking the Lebanese context or the regional context, the different multifaceted crises that we are facing, needs this partnership and requires this partnership from different partners, but especially for governments to be able to react, they need to open up to other partners in the society.
Wonderful. Mirna, last but not least.
Okay, you may hear my children screaming, so I excuse myself, but this is the reality. Okay, so we do work regionally, but since the question is about Lebanon, I think it gives us, we are all facing austerity in enormous levels. That is what is coming. And I do think that if I were to have a few wishes, it would be, don't create just new initiatives because you have a nice idea, whether that's on the civil society side or on the philanthropic side. I think there's a wealth of incredible organizations who are operating and doing phenomenal work. There's due diligence that is required, undoubtedly, but come speak to us, come speak to, you know, we can recommend, guide, come invest with us, etc. I think we can pool funds in order to do important work without necessarily recreating an entire new structure that needs to be managed, etc. Because the second point, in addition to collaboration, is efficiency. I mean, a lot of what we've done right now is helped social enterprises and ourselves rationalize costs. So if we don't create new initiatives, we can potentially mutualize, wow, this is going to be very exciting back here, you know, mutualize costs so that we can take precious, valuable dollars and make them go furthest, to go really towards the vulnerable communities and the important social work that needs to happen, and not just to sort of maintain, you know, organizations and new initiatives. And that's enough. I think I agree with all of my colleagues. Thank you.
Wonderful. You all complemented each other really well. So thank you, Daniel, for that question. It brings us full circle. I can't believe how quickly time has passed. So I want to say to those who asked if this is recorded and where it will be posted. So it's going to be posted on the Issam Fares Institute's Facebook page. So you can always, you know, replay the entire webinar there. And I want to take the opportunity really to thank all of you, Maisa, Zahra, Mirna, the Issam Fares Institute, and She is Arab, of course, for this wonderful initiative, and to all our listeners who have sent in comments and very interesting questions. And we hope to see you again. So thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you, Reem. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.